Professor Joe Fuller, this is a dream come true for me. You are the first professor I met at Harvard Business School. And
yes, that's right.
I was very scared. I showed up to a room full of people that were brilliant. And with a world-renowned scholar on the future of work, you've committed decades of time to study the future of work. And we are probably at one of the largest inflection points for the change of future of work that we've been in since the advent of the internet, I would say. And so to be able to sit down and have this conversation about what is going to change and what the future might look like, a few guesses, is just amazing. So I'd love to just jump right into it. So
let's do it.
You've been looking at the future of work for a long time, right? And so I imagine your predictions from 2020 to now, things have changed dramatically. So provide us a framework or a way to think about like how the organization, how the enterprise is going to change with the adoption of generative AI.
Well, generative AI is probably the most technologically important development since controllable power, since alternating current. And if you look at the history of the adoption of innovations driven off of the availability of electricity, specifically going back even to the steam engine, most of the change took 25 to 30 years. The first thing people did was take steam engines or take alternating current and use it to power their operations as currently configured.
Yep.
So with a technology this profound, it requires such a broad rethink of the way you're going to structure your operations and organize work, incent and measure people, that strangely it often has a bit of a stutter in how quickly it's deployed, because it's not as simple as saying we were using analog switches in the telecom system and now we have digital switches and they're much more efficient and power efficient, so we'll just start deploying them. But we're just making a one-for-one move. Mm-hmm. This is a systemic change. Mm-hmm. I don't think anyone appreciated the extent of the change until really the last year and a half. Mm-hmm. I'm going to come back to something you said. I think actually, I can't help but parse my students, Brian, but that it's relative to the internet analogy, generative AI is mosaic. AI has existed for a long time, just like the internet. Previously ARPANET, previously DARPANET, had existed for a long time. Yeah. But it was Mosaic that could harness that technology's power and put it in a really accessible user format that led to the explosion of internet use. Yeah. AI has existed for a long time. Anyone with a smartphone in their pocket as we're listening to this has got 300, 400, 500 AI elements across those apps that are downloaded. But the breakthrough here is this is going to hugely broaden who can use it and how they can use it, just like Mosaic did when we could get image as well as alphanumeric on the internet.
I think what's so different about the web browser versus now, though, is the web browser was reasonably fast adoption, but we are now having the benefits of that, and we're already networked. Everything is
exactly
networked.
Right.
And so the compression of time of adoption and the opportunity, I think, will be a net new paradigm for I think humanity. So how much faster? I don't even know how to wrestle with that question other than to know this is different.
In terms of the economics, it should be much further along even than it already is. But the types of organizational impediments I was referring to earlier are going to break some of the adoption.
Yeah.
I want to add, you're completely right that networking, the globalization of information, essentially the creation of a single language of high order business, which is now English, which was not the case 100 years ago.
Right.
In fact, if you were thinking 100 years ago, not knowing what language you're going to pick, but 150 years ago, and which language to pick, you would have picked big arguments. Should I pick German or English?
Yeah.
There's another factor, though, which our markets are way more competitive now than they used to be. You don't have monopolies, you don't have oligopolies, you have lots of antitrust enforcement, you have very efficient capital markets. So that's another spur to go fast,
Right.
because one of the key things to understand about generative AI is they with the most data that uses it first wins. So there's a huge incentive to get on your horse and get to work if you're number one, so you can stay number one, or if you're that scrappy number two, number three, number four, you might be able to catch up with number one because they're too busy worrying about what could go wrong with generative AI.
Yep.
And you understand if they get in a virtuous cycle ahead of you, you're never catching up.
Yeah.
So I would say for most industries, we're going to see pretty profound buy-in in 3 to 5 years. But there are some industries, professional services, financial services, technology, and I'm going to argue consumer products
Oh,
are
hot take, Joe.
going to move faster than
Really?
on average.
Consumer products. Consumer software products?
No, consumer products like colas,
Dang.
food, beverages, and why? It's because generative AI, particularly now that it's multimodal, is just incredibly exciting relative to the marketing and sales function of these companies.
Yeah. That's super interesting.
And some of I'm working with one of the leading companies in the space. My NDA with them is about this thick, so I'm not going to mention their name. But the things they're doing already in terms of creating marketing collateral, A/B testing, customized messaging via various social media challenges, but also here I can mention a company linking to companies like Era Technologies that's a leader in AI-driven supply chain rationalization. So suddenly they can see our current shipping schedule out of a certain plant was sending X number of units to Cincinnati and Y number of units to Atlanta. That's too much to Cincinnati, too little to Atlanta, and catch that as the trucks are about to roll.
Right.
So
That's amazing.
because it may be reacting to testing in the markets using social media, pricing models, different types of promotions, and they're able to transmit those findings into action, it takes longer for the display to mount up than it does to do the calculations.
It's amazing. Yeah. It's like really end to end from first touch marketing to supply chain fulfillment and having reactive logistics to that. Like this is something that was a pipe dream 5 years ago,
Yes.
right? I want to go back to your data point. I want to get your perspective, Sid, because this is one that we get asked a lot. Like, how big of a deal are these enterprises' data? Like, if you're not first in market, let's say you're the average company in any category is a mid-market company, right? And so what do they? Yeah, by definition, yeah. So they don't have a mass data advantage, do they? Like. How big of a deal is data? Do you agree with Professor Fuller's perspective here on these enterprises sort of having some unique value in their data that they have?
Well, the thing about data is you don't know how good it is unless you actually put it to the test. A lot of companies think they have a lot of data, especially the bigger ones. And we have terabytes of data that we could train our own model if you wanted to. You're probably misled because you haven't actually tested even small samples of that data in a production environment, deploying a real solution. So when you actually start doing that, you realize that you have to clean up a ton of data to actually make sense of it.
Yep.
And cleaning up, guess what, is super costly, especially if you don't know exactly what you want to do with it. And you didn't know that when you actually collected it. So there's a bunch of stages that data has to go through for it, from collection to the actual point of deployment for it to be useful. And a lot of companies struggle with figuring out that process. But I want to take you back, Joe, to a very interesting analogy in this conversation earlier, which was the browser war, if you will, in the late 90s. During that time, it took a while for the open source, browsers to kick in and that democratization to happen. So today, the leading browser in the world with greater than 80% of web traffic is Chrome. And it's based on an engine called Chromium, which is open source. So when I was at NVIDIA, we literally were able to take the Chromium engine and ship a web application that you can install in your system that is based on Chromium. And that is next level democratization.
Yes.
The interesting bit about the generative AI wave is that you have, because it's based on the technology itself is based on a paper as of today, right? Transformers architecture. That was a Google paper that came out in 2017.
Yes, right.
And even as of today, we have open source models like Llama 3, which in fact the Llama 3 8 billion version performs better than ChatGPT 3.5 at certain tasks, which is insane. So as an enterprise, let's say I have some valuable data, because you don't need too much data for fine tuning. You only need hundreds of samples, right? And I were to fine tune a model, I can build a net new solution that I potentially have monopoly over if my data set is good enough.
Yep.
And you can do that right away today within a couple of quarters, depending on what your strategy is. So given that environment, how would you advise the enterprises to tread this path? Because clearly there's also, with data and all of this pipeline, there's a lot of challenges that enterprises have to deal with to actually build and ship a production-ready solution.
Yeah. Well, I don't think your viewers will have enough patience to listen to my entire answer, but let me pick on a couple of points. Obviously, the models have been learning at a fantastic and in many ways inexplicable rate. As you know, we don't know when and how ChatGPT started doing maths, but it keeps doing them and keeps getting better and better. It's going the long way around because it's trying to interpret text and reform it into numbers. But I think we're learning a couple of things about the use cases. Mm-hmm. And one is that the large language models offer such a huge, infinite context window, if you will, that you can argue they're always going to be superior, but we're also learning a lot of the time they're just dramatic overkill. And so if you ask me for a change in what I see in the people I talk to in the space, who are sophisticated people, that suddenly they're now saying, we're going to have really a proliferation of these models. And some are going to occasionally tap into a large language model. Sometimes you're going to do a task in a large language model. Often when a task is new, you'll start there, but then you'll start understanding what is really important and be able to shape a model that may have a higher mix of proprietary data in it, combine it with elements of large language models, and get you a better solution that's customized for you than what you can get just by having your version of large language model and your logo pop up when you turn it on. I think you touched, Sid, on a couple of other issues I just want to come back to. Companies had spent, I don't know how many tens of billions of dollars in the previous 5 to 8 years trying to harmonize their data. They suddenly woke up and they had 5, 6, 7, 8 big ERP type systems. Interestingly, most of them near monopolies with a couple but certainly oligopolies, if not monopolies. The Workdays, the Salesforces, the SAPs, the Oracles. And they were throwing up their hands because these are hugely expensive and cumbersome systems. Every time you wanted to upgrade it, if you're a big company, you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. I know a very large company that has 81 different versions of SAP running right now.
That feels like it's above average.
Yeah. Yes, and it's an above average size company. It's a Fortune 50 company. But, that's acquisitions had different versions.
Yeah, of course.
They haven't upgraded the Venezuelan subsidiary because of political and economic collapse. It's not worth it to upgrade Korea or whatever.
Yeah.
Their big solution was going to create these so-called data lakes.
All the rage.
Yeah, and so often badly thought out. And now we're going to take a large amount of that data, and in your lake, a bunch of that data's got phosphorus in it. So all of a sudden, algae is growing in your lake in a big hurry because it's low quality data. And so how what's going to happen now, I think, is the proliferation of application-specific AI tools that actually treat the ERP systems as a working data ecosystem. So the types of capabilities that the company is seeking to build and the type of data it's trying to extract from its data, whether it resides in the lake or not, is going to be supported by what I'm going to call a decision intelligence engine, which is going to be constructed around the type of decision you're trying to make. And then the easiest way I can think of the architecture, but Sid, you could correct me about this, is you're going to start creating a whole big family of crawlers who are going to be able to go into different nooks and crannies of the different enterprise systems, the Salesforces, the Workdays, the Oracles, and begin to configure data in ways that directly support the decision. The real AI part of that will be that will be accessible by a human decision maker, and that the AI will be learning from the pattern of choices being made by that decision and that decision maker, given the recommendations provided. So the decision intelligence system has got algorithms, has got instructions it's optimizing for. It tries to optimize across the data. It presents you with a decision. You approve of this decision. Now we're a classic structured learning environment almost, right? You say yes, you say no. And here's the right answer. So we're in some ways we're going back to the future with this. But I think the notion of there are going to be 3 giant, all-knowing large language models and everyone's going to rely on them, which, by the way, would be a fascinating competitive situation, because if everybody's using the exact same model, if we're going to have a lot of this anyhow, then it's purely a question of the human assets and how good their prompt engineering is, and how well they can define the problem and how quickly they can process that problem into a follow-up query or into action, which will then test the efficacy of the choice and then restart that decision intelligence engine I just talked about.
Yes. Are you seeing a big demand? I mean, there's really two approaches that we hear. We hear what you're describing less, which is this concept. These are very, very ambitious kind of like approach is what you're describing, which is they call it like central processing, as in like all the data into at least fine tuning, kind of like the enterprise supermodel that has all the context and then you can sort of interface with it. So that's sort of one line of thinking, and then the other line of thinking is like, well, like to what end? Like, are we outsourcing like the company's like general knowledge database? Is this sort of like just a better way? Is this like Notion on steroids, right? Basically like that you could talk with, or are we instead taking purpose-built smaller models to automate the more discrete operations within a business? Are we focused on underwriting? Are we focused on document ingestion? And that's we're seeing more requests around the latter. Maybe because it's more digestible to think through.
Once again, I'm going to parse you. I'm not going to. Sid was never my student, so I'm not parsing him. It's more implementable.
Yeah.
And the implementation risk is a lot lower.
Yeah.
So if you go, I mean, many people will have heard the reasonably idiotic metaphor of changing the engine on a plane while it's flying. With generative AI, if you really wanted to get its full impact as fast as possible, that's essentially what you're trying to pull off if you're a large company, because most companies continue to ask themselves the wrong fundamental question about generative AI. They say, how can I use this to improve my current processes?
It's like putting your menu online back in the day, right?
Wrong answer, right? The right question is, how do I configure a process to maximize the impact of electricity or mosaic or something, right? Or in this case, generative AI. But when you start looking about that, if you are gigantic incorporated or bloated bureaucracy Inc., you start realizing that as I change to this process, virtually everything around it changes. The job descriptions have to change, the incentive and metrics, the reporting relationships, the stop losses. Nobody in my company currently does the job I'm now describing, so I'm going to have a big training uptake. And since I'm talking about every material process in the company, I cannot turn off, I dare not flash cut over to my new process, nor do I think it's affordable to start running all these parallel processes at once.
Yeah.
And so what we're seeing in most adoption curves for technology, you see a classic S-shaped function, right? So, or people think about it as kind of the crossing the chasm, although it vastly predates that. The notion of a chasm for entrepreneurs was original in that book, not much else was. And the great thing about an S-curve, of course, you put on a semi-log scale, you get a straight line. But what we now see in generative AI is creation of a J-curve. So what is a J-curve? If you imagine a graph, the J part of the curve is actually going below the economic line. The net cost of learning how to do AI while continuing to maintain all your existing processes is net negative. So I know a very large professional services firm, which is a negative $200 million variance in their budget for 2024, just to get licenses that they hadn't budgeted for everybody in the firm. Pretty good business if you're the licensor. So now let's talk about that as a challenge to a public company. Now, if you're a large company and you're trying to really on a broad basis begin to understand how you're going to make the biggest transformation you've ever tried to pull off by applying this broadly in multiple processes fast, you're running up a big bill. And that the slope of that first part of the J curve is very severe, and the trough is very deep. Now, if you're a private company, different story. So that means both because of the literal implementation challenges on management, on staff that we alluded to earlier, and just the absolute magnitude of the economics of trying to do dramatic change, you end up biased toward more focused answers. It's also easier. I did a thing with the Washington Post where we looked at what CEOs were saying about AI in their quarterly calls. And a lot of what they were saying can only be described as kind of vague, platitudinous, and often incorrect statements. There's no one in the C-suite, including the CIO, who knows what to make of this. The CLO, the chief legal officer, though, the CIO, and actually the CHRO, particularly if you're a global company and you've got lots of regulations coming out of Brussels, know what they are saying about it, not what it does, but what kind of risks it poses.
Right.
So everyone is saying, stop, or slow. So what happens is, coming back to my contention that you're going to see some consumer packaged goods companies be surprisingly quick adopters, is focus in on those functions or operations where there's just inarguably a huge amount of economic leverage.
Yep.
And so much so that you can rapidly offset the redundancy of running parallel operations. Right. Now, one last thought. The vast majority of senior executives I know, when you first start talking about the AI, generative AI, the mindset they adopt is the generative AI is an automation technology. that it's going to do work that's been done by different technology or human being, and that old technology or that human being go away, and now I have generative AI. If you look at the data, what you see is a lot of the impact in AI is not automation, it's augmentative. It's a little bit like the decision intelligence engine I was talking about, that what it allows you to do, the worker doesn't go away, they're just much more efficient at their job. They can do certain elements faster. By the way, greatly raising job satisfaction, because a lot of the things it does are reasonably routine, if not tedious. They're not high value added tasks, and you can just say, since what is generative AI good at? It emulates, it doesn't think, right? So if you can give it my last 30 sales reports and my new data for the key variables, it will do a very good job of replicating a typical sales report. Now, one of the things I've done for fun periodically is get it to generate a document and then ask it to put the document in the style of an author. So I did one and asked it to put it in the style of James Joyce the other day, which was quite amusing because first of all, it lost all the punctuation. And I did Hemingway once, and the longest sentence was like 8 words. But in any case, so there are a lot of things that are dictating the pace here. And it gets us, we haven't even talked about another phenomena, which is pretty soon you're going to start seeing generative AI native companies.
Well, as of current, I mean, they're out there.
Well, they are, but I'm talking about big visible.
Company. Yeah. So
if you said right now, idea, just an illustration of an idea, which probably our finance friends would say is,
there's venture capitalists in this building, so be careful.
Yeah.
Let's make it funded.
This would be kind of. Well, let's go to. Many people know the G3 company out of Brazil that bought a bunch of packaged goods companies like Kraft Heinz. Their hypothesis was, I can go and buy these very established companies with very diverse sets of brands, and I can bring a new management system in, new incentives, new metrics, new discipline, and improve the performance of these operations. And I would say that the outcomes ultimately been mixed. Often models like that have really good early results, and then all of a sudden the fact that life is hard and the people that used to run those companies are actually pretty smart too, some of the trade-offs that you hadn't fully appreciated were existing, come to the fore. Put that aside. What if I build a packaged goods AI scaffolding or architecture, whatever you want to say, and then I go out to buy those brands because I want the brands and the formulations. I don't want any of the management process. So it would not surprise me, given the avalanche of at-risk, particularly private equity capital, with a very limited amount of property they have to buy. If you get an innovative business model that says, we're going to pick companies or industries where the value creation rests on a proposition that we will literally have an exponentially lower cost structure in white collar, because what we're going to do is get the IP, the brands, the trademarks, the distribution, and the physical plant. But I need, you have 15,000 white collar workers, I might need 750, because I'm also going to outsource a lot of stuff, maybe to other native generative AI companies that are they're about a next wave of outsourcing, saying if illustration, if a good tell, by the way, on this is what jobs in a company are fully remote, don't have to come to the office at all. Pretty soon companies are going to start saying, we told the internal auditors they never have to come to work here again. mostly because we don't like them. But what they do for a living, it doesn't. They're querying systems, so they can do that if they want to live in Wyoming. God bless them. Then the next question is, why do we employ these guys at all? And suddenly, if there's someone sitting there saying, I have built an idealized information environment, which started with generative AI as the main sequence, and I've hung things around it, but it's all generative AI native for internal audit, I just go to every CFO on Wall Street and say, I can outsource this at probably, with a whopping margin, probably at 35% of what you're paying for it right now. Sold, done. In part because that CFO is under pressure to figure out a way to fund his J-curve.
Right, yeah. Never a better time to tell a CFO
absolutely.
If you're reducing cost structure right now. So I think that's the other lens. You can take it from the private equity lens, which is like, what is creating the scaffolding? We're also seeing a number of private, well-established companies come to us with the same lens, saying like, what is the AI native version of us that we can reinvent ourselves to? And they have such a unique opportunity, because the challenge in creating the scaffolding is you have to be an expert at the jobs to be done from the top level all the way down to the atomic level.
You bet.
And so it's such a powerful time to be a private mid-market company if you can lean in here and say, we're willing to put the work, and their J-curve isn't as steep as these publics, right? Because they have all the information mapped out in a relatively accessible way. They're able to reinvent the entire company around software.
I once wrote an article called "Why Be Public," and the answer is there are only two reasons to be, public. The one is that your market to book value is inverted, so you're basically a zombie, or you're public because you needed the exit for the former owner. But there's nothing in being public that any executive who's ever done it wants to replicate in their life, right? We just have a huge amount of capital locked in those companies, and then of course because of idiotic elements of the U.S. tax law, you drive the need for exits from private equity, which keeps the public markets constantly refreshed, even though they should be shrinking. If you go, a private company though is actually doing what we would any finance guru would tell you they have to do. They're making an NPV optimizing decision, but they don't have to make period next.
Right.
Or they can at least have they have the ability to decide not to.
Yeah.
When you get to third, fourth, fifth generation private companies, where often there are stakeholders who are not in management, it's different than if you're a unicorn that was venture capital funded and has never had to go public, or if you are a private company that has kept a fairly consolidated, at least management equity layer that gets to make management decisions and appoint management.
They have a huge advantage right now.
Gigantic advantage.
Yeah, and they should take advantage of it. And the other thing, why I was so shocked about the packaged goods example, and it's quite obvious when you lay it out in sales and marketing, but the more digital we see the product being, risk, capital, right, insurance, the more opportunity there is across the entire company's ecosystem to AIify, make the entire thing AI native. So we have insurance companies come to us, these managing general agents, which are the pure definition of there is no physical product, right? There's agents on one end that are sourcing deals, there's a reinsurer on the other end that's backing the capital, and they're a critical player in the ecosystem.
Sure.
And they're forward-leaning enough, which is amazing. You don't see this in the public insurance markets at the same level, but in the privates we're seeing it, where they're like, all right, here is every single workflow. We know we're not going to source in great AI talent, but we know what needs to be done, and just partner with us, and we're just AI native builders, right? And so we sort of build these sort of SaaS solutions for them, and their ambitions are changing from being just a heavy sort of steady state, slow grow cash flow business, great business, better margin structure than I even knew. Just saying we might not hire another person, but we're just going to continue to scale AUM and scale premium
Yep.
in a way that like
Yep.
was just never possible.
That actually is visible in sectoral data for publics too.
Interesting.
What you see is financial services, tech, and professional services, including the kind of public AI consultancies, the Accentures of the world. They're not only are they the early adopters of AI in terms of you looking at their job descriptions, but you can see the impact of AI on their operations because their job postings are shrinking.
That's interesting.
So they're getting that
Interesting.
early adoption where they're beginning to see some efficiencies. Now there are some collinearities with the macro environment for those companies, certainly for the professional services firms and for the tech companies. But I mean, the layoffs in tech, oh my gosh, they're not perpetual growth machines, are largely a reflection of things like Copilot and the fact that they were undisciplined about their hiring for legacy systems and suddenly realized they'd been undisciplined and they weren't going to use the legacy system for at least need all the software engineers and project managers to maintain those systems because they could automate 50% of the code writing by augmentation of the remaining software engineers. I've done a model with a large consultancy looking at the 900 so-called ONET codes, the 900 occupations that the Department of Labor in the United States has tracked over decades. And so we continue to use that data because we have such great longitudinal data, even though in the ONET codes there are 26 different codes for railroad workers, including a dickey driver. A dickey is a little small locomotive that in train yards tows other train cars around to relocate them. So we have a dickey driver ONET code. I need to look up how many dickey drivers are left. We only have 4 for IT. But even with those limitations, we've taken the tasks described in each and scored those tasks in terms of their potential for automation and augmentation.
Interesting.
And what we find is in a lot of those white collar jobs in industries like financial services, across all industries, the number of hours related to tasks that look either automatable or augmentative using generative AIs in the low 40th percentile. But in some industries, particularly for entry-level jobs, you're talking 85. So many of us know people who were entry-level analysts in investment banking. Many of them had miserable experiences. Happily, many of them are incredibly talented to get that job, and then they come to our school to get out of that job. But they don't have to worry about it anymore because the job's going away.
Yeah. Fortunately, it's getting rid of the jobs that people kind of are
yes,
for the most part.
It's a lot easier to say that from the perspective of a young man as opposed to someone who's been in an equivalent job, let's say an insurance underwriter for the last 25 years.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for calling me young man. I feel great. I think I'm curious what your data shows. Like we've just seen data entry just get.
Yeah, it's just vaporized.
Yeah, and it's like the companies that are still having these large outsourced teams, they're basically lighting money on fire every month. And the path from I have a bunch of sources of data and I have humans inputted into a form to get into a CRM, we've seen you can get rid of about 95% of the data entry specialists, and actually with higher accuracy. These humans are, there's often offshore teams, they're between 96 and 99% accuracy. And versus a fine-tuned model, we're 99 to 99.9% after enough updating. And so it's not only are we, and the other thing that's interesting is many of these businesses that have data entry as a core function, the speed of that data entry is kind of important. And so they're anything that gets queued up and sort of not pulled into a sometimes application or loan origination or mortgage under consideration is actually a top line loss as well. So not only are you removing the cost structure, but you're fundamentally changing the bottleneck in the business.
You bet. And we're going to get AI will not only allow you to do operations like that, staircase worth of improvements in your economics, not just a step function improvement. But also, it's going to be very helpful at understanding the all-in economics of a decision. I mean, the thing that human beings, whether they're executives or bureaucrats, professors even, don't really understand systems. I mean, it's a hard thing, and I think one of the reasons that a lot of decision rights in complicated organizations are held by people of long experience is they've developed a heuristic of how that market or that setting works that really is they have a sense of the system. Sometimes they can't really describe it.
Right.
But since a generative AI system can do infinite number of Monte Carlo simulations of a choice very quickly, now I have the ability to say, based on that photo of that damaged car, we're not going to send it to a claims underwriter to judge whether it's worth repairing.
Right.
We're just skipping that step.
Yep.
The car's a write-off. In fact, we want to, and I'm going to say something that's a little bit cynical about insurance companies, because of the nature, most people looking at a badly damaged car doing this is going to be a nightmare, what am I going to do to get to work? They will have scored the value of making an early offer that might be lower than they ultimately would have settled for historically, that they would have dispensed to the insured party historically.
Right.
So say they'll learn, if you move fast with a definitive, I'll give you a check right now, the car's a write-off, we'll have it teared away, and here's $15,000. When had it gone to a claims adjuster, who's saying, well, we can, by the way, I'm actually speaking from personal experience, I'll tell you about it in a second. We could, but there's a bunch of the car that's salvageable as spare parts. Really, we can give you $23,000. We're going to give you $23,500. That extra amount is a huge amount of economics for the company. But if they know through, pretty simple-minded mining of previous transactions that people would prefer to have a check now, and you don't have to explain to them that maybe they're leaving $5,000 on the table or $8,000 on the table. I had a parked car in front of my house hit by happily no one was hurt, by a drunk driver, and it went over and hit a telephone pole, which fortunately didn't fall on my house, but bent the axle in the front. So the car was a write-off, and almost immediately the insurer was like, well, where it's a write-off, so how about $10,000? And I was like, okay, how about $25,000? And we went from there. But and this gets us back to the decision intelligence notion that you get that systems effects in big companies by being able to relate and query all different sources of data in your company simultaneously, as opposed to it passes through a process.
Yeah.
There's huge implications, by the way, for the consulting industry.
Oh yeah. I mean, I didn't even introduce, that's obviously your background, right?
Yeah.
Like you're the founder of Monitor Group, right? Everyone knows
Back in
this.
the day, yeah.
Everyone knows, Deloitte Monitor, right? Which Deloitte bought your company, and so it's like you are a subject matter expert of helping these large organizations, enterprises deal with this change. Probably even as relevant as you being a future work expert. I mean, you've done it for decades and decades on the ground. So please.
Just that a lot of consulting historically has basically been information arbitrage.
Yeah.
And it's not cynical. It's not that you say, oh, they don't even know what they don't know, we won't tell them they don't. You say, well, we did this analysis, and then we went to this person and got their input and that input, and we've now brought it all together.
Yeah.
It's it's a process intense task that takes good social skills and a sense of what the question is, but the sense of what the question is now called prompt engineering. So so the productivity improvements that some research at the business school showed is you had a kind of an immediate 20% improvement in productivity of analysts and consulting firms just by giving them the tool. And very interestingly, what we saw is that, to make it easy, if 75th quartile and above in performance rating before the deployment of AI, okay, improved almost 20%. The 25th percentile improved in the high 40s.
Oh, interesting.
So you had a big compression in the performance span in the same job. Now, let's remember, these are all people who were hired by the firm for the same job. So it's not like we have a 98-pound weakling and NFL linemen and generative AI turned the 98-pound weakling. Yeah. They're all NFL linemen, right? But what in that cohort, and some great research at Stanford showed for a lower compensated job, telemarketing call center reps, that you had a 14% improvement in experienced reps, but a 33% improvement in first-year reps. It's the equivalent of a less competent person, competent person.
Interesting.
And that brings me to a super important and interesting point, an observation, right? So it seems like there are executives in the industry today who are on one of two grounds. One is where the effects and the benefits of AI are clearly observable. Let's say you have the simple data entry jobs, the photo-based insurance adjustment jobs, where you can deploy a solution that is maybe not too complicated and start seeing impacts on your bottom line. And as you mentioned earlier, if you can show the CFO 35% improvement at the bottom line right away, in the short term, it's a very easy sell.
Yeah, we built both of these things, and those are pretty much what the numbers look like. Yeah.
Yes, and then you have the other spectrum of executives who are kind of on the fence, who maybe don't have access to a simple enough use case that they can deploy and test, or maybe it is there and they're not able to see it. And then they read reports like Goldman Sachs, generative AI is a bubble. It's way too complicated to get working. It's way too costly to drive meaningful impact long term. So if you were to come across executives who think that way and are yet to experience the significant impact to their bottom line or to the top line using generative AI, what would your advice be to them to be in the right place as the space evolves?
It's highly context and industry specific, obviously. But what I'd say is, going back to your citation of the Goldman Sachs work, this isn't a finished, ready product. Anybody who's looked at OpenAI's May product demos sees that it's in a year plus the shift from ChatGPT 4 to 4.0 is incredible. So we're imagine the big Nordic ski jump in the Olympics with all the famous crashes and everyone holds their breath when anyone starts their run. The notion, well, it's too cumbersome and too expensive. Yeah, early cars were cumbersome and expensive, and there weren't any roads. So let's just give it a little time here, people. Yeah. And also, this gets us back to when you start describing your problem as one that can be solved by generative AI, and assuming it's got to be a large language model, that's the equivalent, in my view, of saying, I need a pile driver to drive any fastener into any surface. So if I want to drive a pile for a new skyscraper in Manhattan, I need to have a pile driver. And since the way I drive fasteners, I use pile drivers, when I'm driving nails in the counter, in the kitchenette, on the 44th floor for the law firm that's going to occupy that, I need to bring in a pile driver to drive the nail. What we have now are a long history of AI supported, not generative AI, supported applications. We will see a maturation where generative AI is integrated with or a feature or represents a processing path used for occasional types of transactions in all sorts of different settings, but it's not going to be everything's got to be the pile driver. And so this is too expensive and too cumbersome, it takes too long. That's a retrospective backcast. Pretty soon, we're going to have AI systems that are being designed to train other AI systems at scale. And so we can't, I mean, with all due respect to that thinking, I think it's a very appropriate caution to companies making period next decisions under pressure, which a lot of companies are because of the lackluster, I'll call it, economy. But the question any decision maker in these companies has got to make is, how much risk am I willing to assume? And there are risks on both sides. If I go too fast, if I lose data sovereignty, if I lose control of my processes, if this becomes a giant sucking sound on my expenses because, I'm trying to change everything all at once and I'm going to miss my earnings, be next week's Nike, sunrise to sunset, and they miss, and I'm putting my career, my company at risk, that's a risk. Another risk is I wake up 3 years from now and I've got an generative AI native competitor, or my arch rival, or a bigger or smaller company manage that earlier set of risks I talked about more effectively. Now they've got an AI-driven decision-making architecture, they've got a decision intelligence-based system, and I'm still doing manual data entry, and that's now called, I'm dead. And my hope is I can get them to buy me at a handsome price because they don't need my management capability, but they probably want my accounts and they probably want my data because they're going to make a lot of money on that because it's just complete bolt-on. All I'm doing is moving the revenue over and none of the costs.
Yeah.
That's, if I were a young man, I'd be trying to operationalize that in some industry.
Yeah. I think we've chatted with folks on sort of both sides of this issue, and I think where we've seen successful messaging across the next quarter concerned executive is like attacking the use cases that actually show ROI next quarter, of which there are a number of highly defined single task purpose use cases that are driving bottom line results for a company. I think once they feel that hit the bottom line, and it's literally under 90 days for lots of these use cases, that gives that next company quarter executive the ability to say, oh wow, like this will probably be the most bottom line expansion if you just automate your document ingestion process that the company's had in any single quarter ever by removing all that cost out of the system. And so we very much say, like, you don't have to be a sort of somebody that believes in the highly compressed digital transformation of AI like we do. Like, all you have to believe is that if you remove this cost out of the system, that it goes to the bottom line, and you'll be able to just agree that will happen on your P&L, and then execute.
That makes perfect sense to me. I would offer a couple of corollary points. One is, most CFOs have come up through CFO organizations, which means they've been in innumerable meetings in the last 10, 15, 20 years where some tech vendor was saying that was going to happen.
Right.
And if you spend $220 million installing SAP FM, we're going to have all these wonderful efficiencies, and it's 3 years late, it's $100 million over budget, the specifications have changed. The second thing I just say is, I believe that in a lot of settings, I'd be wrapping that storyline in, some a pretty bow that says you're also getting some optionality here. you're going to get that immediate payback, but you're going to start extending the footprint of generative AI into your operation.
Yep.
And this is a kind of a geodesic solution space.
What was that?
A geodesic.
Help me out here.
Well, so in linear program, there was something called the Kamarkar model. And historically, linear programs, they basically just kept calculating all the results till they got the best one.
Mm-hmm.
So when you were scheduling the airlines in the early 1980s, running a linear program for a route configuration took days. We were actually more than a week for a big airline.
Yeah.
And then it would give you an optimization, and you could only tackle a few variables, things like that. What Kamarkar, who's a Bell Labs guy, figured out is, imagine all the solutions as a geodesic shape, and you're starting in the center of this orb. As you start doing calculations, you're going to start seeing, is each sequential calculation worse than the last one? Then we can assume the planar surface I was heading toward is worse than some other solution, unknown, heading toward a different planar surface or a different vector from the origin.
Yep.
So all of a sudden you could prune
Right.
huge amounts of the search. Massive, brilliant. I don't know if you want a Nobel Prize, certainly deserve one, but massive economic impact by doing it that way.
Right.
So if I'm that CFO, it's like, okay, I'm actually learning how to apply generative AI.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the implementation challenges, how this all works, I'm going to learn that. But also, as I've now done this process, I'm going to be right up against the next set of processes. And I'm going to understand maybe how the output that I'm now being created is being processed, and how, now that I've got clean data, algorithmically delivered to this adjacent process, I can bring this same logic to that one.
Exactly.
But to do it incrementally manages my risk more.
Yeah.
And since you're risk averse, I'll give you your slice of cake now.
Yeah.
But it's, that there's more cake.
Yeah.
And so we're going to take this wedge, but it came out of a whole cake. It's not, and not a very good analogy, so don't use that.
But I think your
clients.
point is like, so we see this kind of, that exact risk appetite play out in that exact sequence, which is so fascinating. I didn't know the orb thing, so I'll bring that one home for my wife and pretend like I'm smart. But we see, the data ingestion and the manipulation of that with AI and removing that from the cost structure as the onlay into saying, okay, great, now that my data is going into here, you guys have just proven to me, you guys have just added money to my bottom line, and now I'm actually just going to reinvest that into the next part of the sequence, because it's, again, all digital. And so not only are we going to ingest the data autonomously or near autonomously, depending on the specific use case, now whatever that workflow is, sometimes it's operation systems or a CRM, they're ready to bite off the big one.
Well, that's if you can get them there, that's great. And what I'd be saying to them early on is, the right way to do this is pay as you go, not buy one fix and then decide whether to buy another.
Exactly.
So because the stop, start, first of all, just costs you more money.
Yeah.
And once I prove it to you the first time, but instead of saying we're going to save 10 million, I'm going to book 10 million in savings, book the 7, which is a windfall for you, and give me the 3. And I'll get you another 10. And keep giving me 3 every 6 months. You get 10. What part of this don't you understand? I think this is the type of thinking that will get companies more self-confident, and you can see this when companies. You can see it in the few companies that are really delivering or trying to deliver decision intelligence, because what they are getting is outsized positive results. And suddenly companies go from demonstration to do the whole thing. Well, I think when you're adopting any mission critical new technology, you need to gain confidence. And so the registering some wins
Yeah.
not only gives that decision maker confidence, it gives that decision maker more credibility and ammunition to convince skeptics or other people who are conservative in the organization that this is worth the lift.
I think that's right. Yeah, and we'll get the AI enthusiasts in the organization that'll come talk to us about implementing it, and they have these huge grand plans, and we actually won't even offer them this big solution. We'll be like, great, I understand you're excited. I understand this end-to-end vision. Like, we are willing to start with this small project, because then when they actually bring that to the committee, it's like, okay, great, we can all agree that this makes sense, and we could do this next maybe. And so we won't even offer like the huge project.
An important thing to recognize, at least with public companies, is that now boards are beginning to ask, and CEOs are going to be asked, well, we've got our AI strategy, where's my money?
Right.
Where are all my efficiencies I'm supposed to get? And that's going to motivate people to have an answer other than we don't know,
right.
or the chief legal officer told us we couldn't do anything yet.
Yeah.
And so how we start exploiting the fact that there is, both because of the difficulty in a lot of markets now, that companies are worried about making their numbers, but also there's a growing sense that we should be seeing some returns here and some action here. That's going to get people to try that experiment, and if they pick the right thing in a function that's got some real costs in it, and view it as a process, not a transaction.
Exactly.
They're going to benefit and get on that virtuous cycle, be the company that looks 5 years from now, looks back and doesn't regret being overly cautious and lacking the imagination of just how much impact this is going to have.
Professor Fuller, this has been such a pleasure. If any of the large publics need some future of work, I hope they support to think about their org. I hope they have the good grace to get some advice from you. And if they need any AI native software, I hope they reach out to us.
It's been a fun conversation, and I'm really excited to see everything that unfolds here.
Yeah, thanks so much.
You bet.